The boss is, indisposed just now, doll, but if you try back another night, I'm sure he'll give you the chance to entertain him. That the no-neck Italian in the cheap pinstripes didn't bother to disguise his leering as he spoke to her didn't surprise Josephine. Neither her dark dress nor the violet headscarf she'd chosen to complement her dusky skin was the least bit indecent, but some men would stare at anything with a pulse. Normally she'd mark him down for a tiny little curse or two for a slight like that. It would be the easiest thing in the world to put a wet blanket all over his love life for a week or 3, but with everything else going on, disrespect ranked at the bottom of her list for once. With the floozies he and his kind hung out with, she was sure he'd seen plenty of women who liked to show off more than their knees. Josephine opened her mouth to give the lug a piece of her mind but was cut off by the other man smoking on the far end of the stoop. "Whoa, ease off there, Tony, this one ain't no Dora," he said, looking up far enough that she could finally see past his dark gray fedora to the speaker's angular face before taking a long drag off his lucky. "This one here's the real deal, some kind of spooky shit. If she wants to see the boss, I say we let her in." "Oh, this one's the gypsy you all talked about?" Tony asked, practically ignoring her presence. "I thought she was supposed to be a real looker." In a single moment, Josephine went from mollified to outraged. She stormed past the disrespectful man with the bulge in his jacket where he kept his Colt 45. For a moment, he moved to stop her. However, as soon, she gave him an icy glare and hissed, "Romani." Gypsy is a slur comparable with, well, you know, they've got plenty of words like that for Italians in this city, don't they? He opened the door instead of holding it shut. "Okay, sister. Your funeral," he laughed. "The big cheese is in his library with a couple guests. I assume you know the way." Josephine didn't answer as she strode by him. Instead, she gave the man the cold shoulder and made a mental note to give Tony a seriously bad day with her deck once everything with Pastor Ezekiel was resolved. Though the outside of the house seemed to be nothing but a well-appointed brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, the inside of it looked more like a mansion. Art Deco bookshelves dominated the walls. Stained glass Tiffany lamps were present throughout the well-appointed rooms, and crimson dominated the color scheme everywhere she looked. As she walked by the parlor, another man with a bulging jacket looked up from his folded paper at her before he went back to reading it, which struck her as ironic. It had made no sense to her that the Gambinos would put so much effort into protecting the one man in this whole stinking city that no one was likely to be able to kill until she realized that it was the other way around. They weren't his guards but his jailers or perhaps his zookeeper. That made more sense to her. But she doubted very much that all of these thugs and their guns could do much to keep their monster in his cage if he decided he wanted to stretch his legs. She didn't know where the library was, but it was easy to follow the laughter and make her way there. After all, there was only one reason for women to be in this house, to entertain Hugo. She found him huddled together with 2 flappers around a phonograph, deciding which of the records in his small collection to try next. The redhead wore a mauve blouse that was low-cut enough to show a hint of cleavage and was well past indecent in Josephine's eyes. In contrast, the blonde wore a slightly more restrained taupe dress that shifted suggestively along with her loops of pearl necklaces wherever she moved, in a way that somehow seemed even more sexual, though. "It's true, darling, Let's Misbehave is a wonderful song. You really can't beat it with a stick, but some of the magic just disappears when you can't dance to it," the blonde woman said, not yet noticing Josephine's presence. "No one has forbidden you from dancing, my little morsel," the man she came to see said with a faint French accent as he put the record on the player and began to wind it up. "Oh, will you finally dance with me, darling?" she asked, but he responded with a shake of his head. "No, you two will dance with each other while I study every detail about your strange American ways and speak to my good friend Josephine," he answered as he put the needle down. Then he stood as the first strains of warbling jazz echoed out from his fancy contraption and turned to look at Josephine. She wasn't surprised. He'd probably smelled her before she'd walked in the front door. The other women looked up at once too, first at her and then at each other, but she ignored them. "Monsignor Montmorillon, we need to talk," she said respectfully. No matter how much the handsome man might make her skin crawl, she needed his help. But even if she didn't, she had no desire for him to rip her head off in a fit of pique. She didn't have to be psychic to know that every cushion and carpet in the place was red to hide the stains that his very existence left in its wake. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, neither his perfectly tailored outfit nor his genteel, welcoming expression could disguise the miasma of death radiating off him like a fog. The man still wore a light gray summer suit with white shoes even though it was already well past Labor Day. It was a common faux pas for him since days and weeks mattered so little to his kind. Still, she wondered just how many suits like that he had to throw away because of stains that could never be removed. The other women couldn't see past the fine tailoring, of course. They just thought he was another rich John. Or maybe if they'd visited him before and survived the experience, and were into this sort of thing. Some people were. After so many readings she knew more about those strange picadillos than she'd ever want to admit. Josephine knew a lot of girls with a morphine or laudanum habit that would do just about anything for their next fix. Still, she hoped that anything would never have to include a night at Chateau Montmorillon for any of them. "Of course, mademoiselle, as I told you when last we met, you are welcome in my home at any time," he said with a smile almost as strong as his accent. "What is it I can do for you this night?" "I was hoping we could talk alone," she said, cocking her head toward the two girls that had started to do a little fox trot together while they pretended not to be paying attention to a conversation that most definitely did not concern them. As she spoke, she looked for his fangs and again noted how they were practically invisible, which was always a trip for her. "I need a favor." "Well, Ezekiel needs the favor, but I'm the one doing the asking." "Oh, ma chérie, but I was not expecting you. So I invited these beauties to while away the evening hours with. As you know, I get so bored when my American friends have no work for me," he answered, shaking his head. "So I'm afraid unless it is life and death, it will have to wait until Thursday." "Perhaps. But it is," she said, waiting for him to finish speaking before she responded with only a shade of the urgency she felt in her heart so as not to appear rude. "Three lives hang in the balance, and you are the only one I know that can do something about it." "Am I?" he asked, more than a little flattered. For such an ancient creature, he had never lost the love of flattery that he'd grown used to as a young marquis. "Well then, perhaps I will hear you out, and if it is as urgent as you say, then perhaps Daisy and Ruth will have to come back and tempt me to dance another night. And if not," he smiled thinly as his words trailed off. Josephine was the last person that needed an explanation about what would happen to her if she burst in uninvited to waste an immortal's time and swallowed hard at the unspoken threat. "Well, ladies, if you would be so kind as to wait in the parlor with Franklin for a moment while I help my good friend Josephine get to the bottom of her little dilemma, I would be ever so grateful." "Ah, but money, the party's just getting started." The busty redhead whined, earning a sympathetic smile and a kiss on her forehead from her strangely sophisticated customer before both women were shooed out of the room. The sliding door was then closed behind them. "Now, what is it I can do for you?" Hugo asked, suddenly appearing in the seat across from her, pouring her a glass of brandy from a crystal decanter. She hadn't even blinked, but she'd still missed the motion. One moment he'd been across the room by the door, and the next, he was seated not 5 feet from her. "You'll forgive me, but I do get cranky when my dinner is late, and even on slow nights like tonight. There are so many demands upon my time." "It was supposed to be just another hoax," she said, taking a quick sip of brandy to settle her nerves before she looked into the eyes of the demon sitting across from her wearing an impeccably shaped human suit. "I only brought Ezekiel in on it because I thought it would be easy money, just like the last few times I'd been to the Bergen estate, and because the priest had done me a good turn recently." A shiver went through her as she realized that if she hadn't invited the old man to join her, she would be in that room right now instead of him. "The Bergens? Those are the power barons, yes. I see their name on the mail for my electricity bill. It is a strange sort of mortal magic, is it not?" he mused, wandering from the topic as he always did. "Do you know how this electromotive force works? I've stared at the electric bulbs in here endlessly but still have yet to understand the trick to it." "I don't, I'm afraid," she shook her head. "But what I really don't understand is what I just saw not 3 hours ago." "What did you see?" he asked, taking the bait. "I confess that even isolated as I am, I have heard some very strange rumors about the patriarch of that family." "Well, before we talk of what happened tonight, I must first tell you about my other recent trips to that family's estate," she said, clearing her throat. This would not be a short story, after all. She started by telling her host about the well-kept grounds of the white Southern-style manor house. It was large enough to fit her whole neighborhood within its wrought iron fences, and the house had more rooms than her tenement had apartments. It was clear that money would never be a problem for this family, even though the father, Morton Bergen, died last year under mysterious circumstances. After inviting more than a few clairvoyants to lead seances, his son, Morton Jr., hit upon her to come out and communicate with the beyond on his behalf. However, she wished that he had not. "Were you able to give the boy the information he sought and provide closure?" Hugo asked, leaning in as she finally started to pique his interest. "Only too well, unfortunately. Unlike the charlatans he'd hired previously, I was able to provide all the answers he sought regarding their accounts," she answered, unable to keep a note of pride entirely out of her voice, "as well as sweep aside certain proclivities that were best kept out of the papers for an additional fee." Hugo probed her for more details on that, but she demurred politely, citing a need to do what was right for all her clients, just as she had done on his behalf. The old man's struggles with homosexuality weren't anyone's business, as she saw it. If he wanted to keep his summer home packed with young artists and musicians with a certain sensitive disposition, then she didn't see how it was anyone's business. It was the 20s, after all, and things were different now. Hugo came from an older time, though, and just that fact might have been enough to get him to refuse her. It was irrelevant to the story, though, and instead, she focused on the most important part, the man's son. Morton Jr., or Morty as he preferred to be called by his friends, was a very creative sort. However, she couldn't say whether all the strange men his father kept around had anything to do with it. All that mattered was once he'd found himself a real psychic, he developed no end of imaginary problems that needed to be addressed by her. He'd sent a car to the city for her twice to deal with curses, and during the summer, he had his fortune read nearly nearly weekly for fear that something was coming to get him, and that he could feel his doom approaching. None of those were as strange as what she'd seen he had done to the library. That last weekend in September, after his chauffeur had brought her there. It was still hot then, and that mansion was about the only place in Baltimore County with air conditioning where she might be welcome. So even though Josephine knew it would be a complete waste of time for her, she still took the long ride out there. After all, $20 was $20, and she had nothing better to do. It had been anything but a waste of her time, though. The man had removed every stick of furniture with corners from the room, and paid someone to plaster all the places where the walls met each other as well as where they joined the ceiling, and the floor so that there were no corners. When she'd gotten there, he'd met her at a round table with delicately arched queen and chairs, and explained that he'd finally figured out that it was the hounds of Tindalos that had been stalking him. "Have you ever heard of the hounds of Tindalos?" she asked Hugo with a note of exasperation. "I know many old and terrible names. More than you even, I expect, but that one is not on the list." "I'm afraid," he confessed as he spread his hands in bafflement. "Neither had I," she agreed. "Not until my esteemed client finally produced the source document for his fears, a pulp fantasy novel of weird fiction stories." Hugo laughed at that, and she let his amusement exhaust itself at poor Morty's expense before she continued. "I attempted to explain the difference between reality and fiction, of course, but gently since he was a paying customer. Morton Jr. might have been 22 in body, but he'd led a very sheltered life while his father was alive. It was only after his death that the man was permitted to read strange things like the pulp novel. As we both know, some of the dread names that those foolish storytellers use are quite real, but this one was a total sham. My customer insisted that it was because of how the creatures were described, and that he'd seen something quite similar in his own night terrors, but I couldn't see anything to it, and left him only somewhat mollified." Josephine went on to explain that later that evening, she'd gone to a local bookseller, and wasted a nickel buying exactly the same issue as Morty had shown her, but there was not a single description of the supposed hounds anywhere to be found in the entire work. Her host laughed once more when she explained that she had a conversation with the clerk, and that the monster had been used in several horror stories to date, but none of them, not even the original author, had done so. Apparently, the man had just said they were too foul to be described. "So you interrupt my feast to tell me about a monster that never existed, Josephine?" the Marquis said, shaking his head. "I thought I knew you better than that." "Of course not, monsieur," she answered quickly. "I was just getting to the important part. I wanted you to understand how it came to be that I parted ways with such a lucrative client. As much as I loved his money, I felt that he would do better in the care of a professional psychotherapist, and thought for sure that I would never be hearing from him again. However, only a week later, my landlord received an urgent call for me from Morton's butler. There had been some sort of supernatural tragedy, and their master was catatonic. This seemed like just another strange ploy for attention from the man. Andy was about to insist that they summon a doctor, when they offered to pay me cab fare, and a sum well over my usual rate if I could come at once." With her story finished, she looked up from her almost empty drink, and back at the hungry eyes of her host. "How was I to know this was anything but another rich man's flight of fancy? So you took the money, and went right over?" Hugo asked disinterestedly. Fearing what might happen if she lost his interest completely, she swallowed hard, and glossed over the conversation she and Ezekiel had on the way there. "Yes," she agreed. "My driver made only a single stop to pick up Ezekiel, and then we took an $8 cab ride well outside city limits. That was when we saw the mirror room." "The mirror room?" he asked, perking up. "Well, technically, it was the gymnasium. I'd seen it before when it was full of normal exercise equipment, but sometime between then and now, he'd had the windows boarded up, and he'd taken every mirror from the rest of the manse, and used them to line every surface. The wall, the floor, and even the ceiling he'd covered with as many reflective surfaces as he possibly could. And when I next saw him, he was sitting there, catatonic on the only chair in the room." Now the Marquis was leaning forward, and hanging on her every word as Josephine continued to tell her story. "So he was just sitting there, surrounded by mirrors?" he asked thoughtfully as he considered her words. "How very peculiar." "It was," she agreed. She was tempted to relate the true strangeness of the sight, but she doubted that Hugo would care about the tiny details she found so jarring. It didn't matter to him that hand mirrors had been nailed in the gaps between large full-length and smaller vanities, but the effect had been striking to her. There was something about the way the oval mirrors had been scattered at random through the field of almost uniformly rectangular ones that unnerved her. He'd even used a few compacts, and put a few shiny pots in the gaps once he'd run the whole house out of mirrors. That wasn't an important detail, though, so she continued. "The truly curious thing wasn't Morty sitting there in the chair. I wouldn't have put it past him to fake some kind of spell or trance to get the reaction he wanted after our previous encounters. The strange thing was the footman. He'd finally had enough of the charade, and had gone into the room to retrieve his master while we were on our way over. By the time we arrived, he'd been standing stock still, frozen in place for almost half an hour. And so Ezekiel decided to go in after them?" Hugo asked darkly. "How very foolish of the old man. I would have expected more from his vaunted instincts. The way that he spoke those words made Josephine sure the centuries-old Marquis sitting across from her knew something. He always sounded arrogant when lording secrets over those few foolish mortals that he found amusing. She didn't let that distract her, though. She'd wait to ask until her tale was complete. Not exactly, she corrected him hesitantly. Ezekiel thought that he might be able to step in only a few feet, and toss a rope over the other man so that we could drag him out of whatever strange, dazzling effect that many reflections had caused on his enfeebled mind. Since neither he nor the priest, cold feel anything malign, he, Asamet the twat of her hat, happened was related, epilepsy or hypnotism thanth, supernatural, so planet Togo, in with his is close it taught just, that, but he got stuck too, didn't he? Hugo asked, with enough certainty that she found herself nodding in agreement until he finished his cryptic statement. Because sometimes you don't have to see things, they just have to see you. What do you mean? Josephine asked, suddenly on the back foot. Have you heard of something like this before? She hadn't even told the Marquis about the brief but overwhelming surge of terror she'd felt at the moment that Ezekiel had stopped moving. Suddenly it was like a landslide was barreling toward her through the ether. Just before it reached her, it suddenly vanished into smoke. She didn't think she would have to tell him though. He seemed to know much more than her already, and he'd never even seen the room. This? Have I seen someone foolish enough to let anything that might be watching view him from every possible angle simultaneously until he's nothing but a metaphysical lure drifting in waters far deeper than he realizes? No, he answered with a shake of his head, but I have seen enough strangeness in the last century to know that what your young client did was a remarkably terrible idea. I agree, she answered truthfully, but I was thinking. You were thinking that since I have no reflection, I might be able to go in there and retrieve your friend before anything worse happens, he asked, interrupting her. Yes, that's it exactly, she agreed. I know it's only 6 hours to sunrise, but I was thinking you could do me a favor, Anne. Josephine's words trailed off as he suddenly vanished from where he was sitting, only to reappear behind her. She could feel the evil radiating from him at that moment, and it was an act of will not to bolt away from him in disgust rather than fear. You recall that I offered you a favor, but at the time, you seemed so resistant. I recall you using the word never, he whispered in her ear. Now the tables have turned, though, and you reek of desperation, so I must ask, do you recall what I said the price for such a thing would be? Goose flesh rippled across her neck, and back at his proximity, and the way that his accent tickled her ear. It was a good pickup line, and she supposed it worked on almost every other woman, but even his little mind games couldn't get around her revulsion. I remember, she whispered, drawing her switchblade from where she kept it in her sleeve. You said you wanted a taste. Andy told you that you would never, ever bite me, but the stakes are high, monsieur. And we are both reasonable people. I'm sure we can reach a compromise somehow. As Josephine finished speaking, she flicked open the blade, and ran it along her left wrist with her right hand as she leaned away from the vampire looming behind her to let the blood drizzle into her now empty brandy glass. She'd considered cutting her palm instead, but she didn't like the idea of damaging her life or her fate lines any more than tonight was already likely to do, so she chose to add one more scar to her extensive collection instead. Monsieur Montmorillon was fixated from the moment the red drizzle started to slowly fill the glass, and moved to watch it as it slowly inched upwards. Very bold, mademoiselle, he said with a smile. I admire your panache if nothing else. I shall accept this token of your esteem, but only because of your boldness. Please know, though, that the next time you come knocking at my door, the price of my assistance will be higher. Then I shall make certain I never have need of it again, she said, pulling her wrist away from the now half-full glass, and wrapping a clean handkerchief around the wound to staunch the bleeding. With the life that you lead, and the people that you spend your time with, you'll forgive me if I don't find that likely, mademoiselle, he laughed. Then, without preamble, he shot back the contents of her bloody glass, and smiled. Very earthy, he murmured. Very old world. I think that I shall look forward to the next time you find yourself in trouble. One can only imagine how much more delicious the wine is when drunk straight from the vine. He smiled then in a way that she was sure would have been seductive if the traces of blood hadn't been so revolting. That view, at least, dispelled the urge to explain to him why his awful metaphor failed on so many levels, though she was quick to snap back at other men that talked down to her, so, in this one case, she would make an exception for the good of all parties involved. Shall we then? She asked, trying to keep a cheerful tone in spite of the fear and disgust that warred behind her fragile smile. I think we shall, he agreed, though I must warn you that even if I can remove your friend from the gaze that he is enthralled within, he might not survive the experience intact. Josephine nodded at that but said nothing as Hugo left the room, and started shouting orders at his pet mobsters. Frank, pay the ladies for me, and ask them to come back tomorrow night. I'm sure to work up quite an appetite from tonight's activities, he called out, and Johnny, please bring the Dwessenberg around. I think the three of us will be going on a little outing for a few hours. Mr. Montmorillon, the man that she presumed to be Johnny responded hesitantly, don't you think we should clear something like this with the boss? He said he didn't want you raising a ruckus like you did the last time without his say-so. I understand, Johnny, Hugo agreed as he kissed his disappointed companions goodbye for the night. But this won't be like last time. This is out in the country to help Josephine's dear, sick friend. If you drive fast, we can be there and back in just over an hour, which will give me 2 or 3 hours to see what can be done about the situation before I must call it a night. Whatever you say, sir, Johnny said, taking the keys from the peg on the wall. But I'm gonna bring an instrument or two anyway, just in case. Oh, I wouldn't put much faith in those things where we're going, Hugo laughed. Now come, Josephine. We must hurry. The sunrise waits for no one. The miles raced by as they flew over the pavement at what Hugo assumed was well above the speed limit. He didn't trouble himself to remember such things, not when he could enjoy the view instead. Though all the area outside the headlights was lost to the 2 humans accompanying him, he could see deep into the darkness on both sides of the roads. The woods they went through were lovely of course, but especially towards the edge of the city. They were devoured by new homes springing up like weeds with increasing frequency. Though he doubted that the woods to the west of Baltimore had ever been as primeval as his beloved forest of Compiègne, it still had its charms. Plus the drive gave him time to study his beautiful companion. He would have wanted her just for the challenge of the thing, but the traces of her enchanted Romani bloodline only made her more desirable. And so, he watched her pretending to be unafraid as his car's tires devoured mile after mile. The drive there was uneventful, and upon reaching the garish Bergen estate, which had all the charm of an austere Protestant church, they were ushered inside. After Josephine made it very clear that the head butler actually had to invite Hugo in, the brief confusion that this caused made Hugo smile. Andy was half tempted to show the servants his fangs just for the shock value, though he was fairly sure that it wouldn't be the strangest thing that they would see tonight. Once inside they were quickly ushered to the room of mirrors, and Hugo was surprised that he indeed felt nothing unusual, just as Josephine had said. So, throwing caution to the wind, he stepped inside, and walked over to the young master that had started all this. Be careful, Josephine called out, but he ignored her. If she'd been careful in the first place then he would be at home enjoying a nice ménage à trois with his lovely dancers instead of looking into things that were better left alone. When Hugo reached the young master, the first thing he did was pick up the book the man was holding to make sure he hadn't actually gotten his hands on some ancient grimoire, and finding it to be another trashy pulp novel he tossed it casually aside. Harrowing tales of wonder. He said to himself as he moved to pick up the lad, I could tell you some tales that would turn your hair white. It was a vague, malicious sensation like sharks circling him just below the water, or a wolf pack on his scent that hadn't quite found him. There was something there though, and for a moment he glimpsed the boy's shattered mind like he was looking over the shoulder of someone else in a crowded theater. In that metaphor though, he was the only stranger. Every other seat was filled with the same shadowy outline, as the entity there with him feasted on the boy's life with hundreds of eyeballs, slowly leeching away all the things that made Morty the person he was. The death of his father, the fact that he'd been the one to electrocute the old man, the bullying that almost broke young Morty at the boarding school he'd been forced to attend for most of his childhood, the summer nights spent watching the fireflies, even the vaguest memories of his mother when he was a young child were being devoured on that fractured screen all at once. That he'd been enduring this psychic vampirism for almost half a day. Andy had not yet succumbed was testament to some hidden strength that the boy had, but Hugo was sure that there would be no saving him. Were he to break the hold that this creature had on Morty, he would still spend the rest of his life as a turnip. So, he released him, letting the wolves and the sharks drift away as they returned to gorging on the prey they'd found rather than pursue a new victim that didn't quite seem to be there. Hugo considered checking in on the mental landscape of the footman who was just as locked in place, but he decided he didn't care enough to bother with the help. So, instead he approached Ezekiel. You know, he whispered into the old man's ear, I suppose I should thank you, even after all the trouble you caused me the last time, I still got to taste our sweet little strumpet thanks to your carelessness. That's just one more sin you can try to fruitlessly pray away. After Hugo had finished gloating he grabbed the old man, and got the same flashes as before. This time the stage of that crowded theater was not yet shattered into 100 different images, and the colors on the film were not so bleached. The only image to be seen here was the burning orphanage that would forever haunt the man. As much as Hugo would have loved to watch that little show, and learn a bit more about the irritating pastor's haunted past, he was forced to let go almost immediately because of the fervor of faith that the old man was projecting to hold back the onslaught bent on devouring every scrap of his soul. How ironic, Hugo said, walking back to rejoin Josephine and the servant standing in the hall. I'm the only one here that can reach your friend, but he's so busy holding off the monster assaulting him with his faith that I can barely touch him. Quite the predicament. Monster? She asked. Do you know what it is? No, he answered. But I suspect it is Azrath, something that is sometimes referred to as the Watcher between scream. And if I'm right, that could make what happens next a bit messy. Hugo chastised himself. He must be getting senile if he thought that invoking the name of an old one when it was practically in the room with him to be a good idea. Messy? What are we going to do? Josephine asked with fear sparkling in her eyes. Well, given that I once saw something like this level a manor larger than this, I should think that you should get all the servants to run for their lives, while I go fetch Johnny's instruments. Hugo's smile broadened as he saw his little fortune teller's worry deepen. Be right back, though, because once I start distracting this thing you're going to need to be the one to drag Ezekiel to the car before things get really crazy. But can't Johnny, she started to ask. Johnny can't save your pastor and be ready with the engine running at the same time now, can he? Hugo pointed out as he walked to the front door. This thing has his hooks deep into your friend already, so even after I steal the spotlight, you are going to have to get him as far away as possible to have even a chance that this thing will lose interest. To her credit, Josephine didn't ask any more stupid questions. She just ran through the house screaming that there was a fire, and that everyone needed to evacuate, while he told Johnny the plan. As a ruse it wasn't complicated, but it was effective. And a dozen servants poured out onto the nighttime gravel drive. Even he was pulling the twin-strength brooms from the trunk of his automobile. Hugo didn't care much for firearms, because he preferred to use his hands to really experience the violence, but if they were good for anything, it was breaking things. So, with 200 rounds of automatic killing power, he walked back into the room to see just how angry he could make an eldritch horror of unknowable power. With one gun in each hand, Hugo opened fire for the first time since he'd been forced to leave France. The bullets didn't seem especially fast to him as they began to spray out of the twin barrels in a flurry of tiny explosions. But it was still hard to do much aiming with both weapons at once. He didn't worry about that though. There were only a handful of people that he had to worry about not hitting as he slowly pivoted around the room, shattering mirrors by the dozens. After the first few gave way in a spray of silvered glass, he could feel the dark pressure starting to build as the rage sought an outlet, but by the time he'd finished making a ruin of the second wall, and was moving on to the third, the gaze of the blind god was becoming truly oppressive. It couldn't see him, but it knew where he was, and what he was doing, and it was outraged that anyone would interfere with it in such a way. Any human that was the focus of such rage would have already been a coarse, gory marmalade right now, but Hugo endured. Still, as a distraction it wasn't as successful as he'd hoped. So when a particularly large shard of glass sprayed out from the slow-motion waterfall of glass he was creating, he snatched it from the air, and jabbed it into his side, ruining another suit in the process.